What's wrong with the government? What's wrong with the government is that we have come to expect too much from it. It takes too much of our wealth and suppresses too much of our freedom. It recognizes no limitations on its own powers, and it believes that just because it does something, whatever it does is right and proper. It is too big, saps too much wealth, has a monopoly on force, and is ever growing. Beginning about 100 years ago, the so-called progressive era, the government at every level in America began to intrude upon the lives of ordinary Americans. With popular support during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the federal government began to decide what food was worthy of consumption, what goods private trains and trucks could carry from manufacturer to market, what salaries employers could pay their workers, what criticism of the government was acceptable, how U.S. senators would be elected, how much income you could keep, and whether you could even consume alcohol. None of these powers was granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So the feds either assumed the powers for themselves while defenders of freedom and night watchmen of the government were asleep, or they amended the Constitution, as in the case of prohibition, the income tax, and stripping the states of the power to choose their senators. They sold this package of big government to the public by calling it progressive, as if to suggest that this was progress. I like Professor Thomas Sowell's explanation of that word. He remarked that the income tax is progressive the way a disease is progressive. The longer it's around, the more painful it gets. These days in Wisconsin, for example, elected representatives fled the state for 3 weeks, effectively preventing the legislature from doing its work. Union mobs mobbed the State House and prevented those representatives who did show up for work from getting to work. When the police were called, the police refused to remove the demonstrators, siding with their fellow union members. Could you imagine any of that happening in the world of private enterprise? In Florida, legislation has been introduced to permit toll takers at toll booths on state highways to refuse to accept cash in any form larger than a $20 bill. If you give them a $50, they could stop you and question you. Would you patronize any business that treated you that way? And in Washington, Congress is hopelessly deadlocked. It can't agree on a budget. It has us in perpetual debt. The vice president is supposedly in charge of bringing both sides together, and he just took off for Moscow. So the Congress just spoon feeds the president enough cash to operate the government for 2 weeks at a time. But even that's not enough money. Last month, the president borrowed $223 billion just to pay interest on old debt and to run the government. Would you invest in a business that proposed to operate like that? What is the common thread here? It is the government's monopoly on force. It is compulsion. It is that there is no way around the government. It is that you can't compete with the government. It is that you can't avoid the government. The children will show up at lousy schools, and the taxpayers will continue to fund them because the government forces us to pay for these schools, and folks don't have the money to send their kids anywhere else. This is the problem with government. It can't compete. It doesn't produce wealth. It only consumes wealth. We can't escape it, and the government knows that. If the government had to perform in order to merit, to deserve our tax dollars and our fidelity, it would collapse. And if we had the right to reject it and purchase the so-called services it offers from other sources, it would go out of business. Only competition, which is basically fear of failure, will keep the government honest. But the government won't let anybody compete with it because the government outlaws what it fears. At the end of the day, government should fear us. You know this. Jefferson said it, and said it well. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. But when the government fears the people, there is liberty.